Hunger doesn't roar on a battlefield, it whispers. It wears down the mind first, then the body, until a soldier can barely lift his weapon. During WWII, rations were planned on maps and timetables, but war rarely follows schedules. Supply lines collapsed. Weather buried food under ice. Patrols lasted days longer than they should have. And every time a stomach growled, a decision had to be made: eat cold food and weaken further, or risk everything for a little warmth, because warmth meant fire, and fire meant smoke. One curl of gray rising into the air could reveal an entire squad's position. One spark could invite artillery or a sniper's bullet. Even the faint smell of cooking meat could draw an enemy. Night patrol straight to a hidden camp. Soldiers learned that staying alive required more than ammunition. It required disappearing. So they became students of silence. They watched how heat moved through earth, how air fed a flame, how shadows could hide survival itself. Out here, cooking wasn't a comfort. It was a gamble. And yet, a warm meal could mean the difference between collapsing in the snow and fighting one more day. To survive, they had to make fire invisible. In war, the enemy you see is rarely the one who kills you. A flicker of light in the dark, a faint smell carried on the wind. That was enough for trained eyes to strike. During WWII, armies weren't just watching the horizon. They were watching the smoke. Recon planes scanned forests for rising plumes. Snipers learned to track the soft glow of embers through their scopes. Even the crackle of burning wood could betray a hidden position to someone, listening in absolute silence. Fire was comfort. Smoke was a death sentence. The irony was brutal. The body needed hot food more when conditions were at their worst. Freezing nights, drenched uniforms, exhaustion that turned bones to lead. Cold calories kept you alive, but warm calories kept you human. Yet, the moment a soldier lit a fire, he was no longer invisible. He became a target, so the battlefield rewired survival instincts. Fire was still necessary, but it had to be tamed, contained, disguised. Soldiers began experimenting in whispers, digging, shielding, masking heat and flame however they could. They weren't cooking for pleasure anymore. They were cooking against time, cold, and enemy eyes. To stay hidden, fire had to break its oldest habit. It had to stop announcing itself. They called it the Dakota Hole, though many soldiers learned it without knowing its name. It was simple, ancient, and brilliant, a fire that lived underground. Instead of flames licking upward into the air, heat stayed low, hidden inside the earth. The design came from indigenous ingenuity. Long before modern warfare, two holes connected by a tunnel. One hole held the fire. The other fed oxygen from below. When done right, the flames burned hotter, cleaner, and with so little smoke the enemy could never see it. Soldiers dug fast using helmets as shovels, cutting into frozen soil or soft mud wherever they camped. They lined the walls with stones when they could find them. If not, the dirt alone worked well enough. Fuel was chosen carefully: dry twigs, stripped bark, small branches that burned with more heat than fuss. Every piece was tested by instinct because the wrong wood could betray them. Tins of rations sat directly over the hole, warming silently in the darkness. Sometimes a squad would gather around it, close enough to feel hope rising with the heat, but far enough to stay unseen. Every breath around it felt safer. It wasn't a roaring campfire, but a quiet promise that life still held warmth. The Dakota Hole didn't just hide fire. It turned the ground into a shield, a fireplace, and a kitchen. Silence kept them alive. Soldiers trusted it the way you trust a secret, because their lives balanced on its silence. Underground, fire became invisible, and survival became possible. But the underground wasn't the only place fire learned to hide. Soldiers became inventors out of necessity, transforming scraps of war into tools of survival. Empty ration tins were everywhere. Scouts realized these metal cylinders could become miniature stoves. Punch a few air holes near the bottom, place fuel inside, and suddenly you had a controlled burn that used every drop of oxygen with precision. Flames stayed low. Smoke thinned to nothing. Some adapted the trick further. They packed clay around the tin to trap heat and muffle light. Others buried half the stove so the earth became a natural barrier. If they had stones nearby, they'd build tiny walls of rock, just enough to reflect heat toward the pot while blocking enemy sightlines. No matter the terrain, they found a way to make warmth behave. Sometimes a helmet became a skillet. A single piece of charcoal, saved from a previous fire, could heat a soldier's meal without ever giving off a telltale plume. Soldiers learned how different woods burned. Pine snapped and betrayed you. Hardwoods stayed quiet and clean. They fed flames like a secret, carefully, never letting them rise. What looked like simple tinkering was really science under pressure. Fuel efficiency, airflow control, thermal masking, learned through instinct and fear instead of textbooks. These weren't engineers in a workshop. They were freezing men trying to stay alive without being found. The battlefield rewarded ingenuity. Every invisible stove was proof that the will to eat and to survive could outsmart even the most watchful enemy. Sometimes there was no time to build anything. Patrols ran long. Retreats turned chaotic. Winter storms swallowed entire camps before the men could even think about digging a hole. In those moments, soldiers learned a darker art, cooking with heat that someone else left behind. They waited for the enemy to move, then crept into the ghost of their fire. A ring of embers still breathing beneath ash, no flame, no crackle. Just quiet warmth ready to serve whoever was brave. Enough to borrow it, they would place. Their tins close, never directly on top, letting the slow pulse of heat seep into their food. There was danger in every second spent near an enemy's old position. Danger of gunfire. Danger of being spotted returning to shadows that weren't theirs. But hunger made bold negotiators. You on armored front lines. Engine blocks became stoves. A tank rolling through the cold left metal hot for minutes. Soldiers learned that if you set a can against that glowing steel, the meal would warm without. A trace of smoke, artillery, shells freshly. Fired, still radiated heat, deadly. A few minutes earlier, life-saving in the right hands. Even burning buildings, once evacuated, left walls hot enough to cook against if you knew where to place your food. These weren't heroic moments. They were quiet thefts of survival, stolen from battle itself. In the chessboard of war, soldiers learned the smartest move sometimes wasn't to make fire, but to take heat. Warm food was only half the battle. The human body in war becomes a machine running on hope and calories, and soldiers had to stretch every bite further than nature ever intended. They learned to cook with strategy, not flavor. Fat became more valuable than taste. A small piece of meat could keep a man going longer if he rendered the grease and soaked his bread or biscuits in it. A single spoonful of warmed lard could feel like fuel injected straight into survival. Quiet. Snacks replaced full meals. Soldiers carried dried foods tucked into coats or pockets, letting body heat soften them slowly. When they scavenged vegetables or game, clay baking kept smells contained, food sealed in earth, cooked invisibly beneath the ashes. No aroma drifting through the forest meant no unwanted company, and everything was rationed with discipline. If one man cooked, another watched for danger. They took turns tasting warmth, never eating faster than the fire could stay hidden. Every calorie was earned with caution. Cooking in wartime wasn't about satisfaction. It was math. It was secrecy. It was the constant negotiation between hunger and exposure. And for those who mastered it, each quiet meal was a small victory against the cold, the enemy, and the war itself. The invisible. Stove was never written into official manuals or celebrated in wartime reports. It lived in the hands of ordinary soldiers who refused to let hunger make them prey. When the war ended, many of these tricks faded into memory, unrecorded, uncredited, but never truly gone. Survival schools today still teach low-smoke fires, underground cooking pits, and heat conservation. Special forces units quietly train the same principles learned in frozen forests and shattered cities decades ago, because stealth cooking wasn't just a tactic. It was resilience, a promise that even when stripped of comfort, humans can still create warmth and nourishment in the dark. Those soldiers proved that intelligence isn't always loud, and innovation isn't always visible. Sometimes the greatest fight is simply to stay alive one more night. And inside every hidden flame, their ingenuity still burns, silent, unseen, but unforgettable.